The static crackled through the command center at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a blade through silk. Major Reyna Ghost Vasquez hadn't moved from her position in the shadows of the observation deck, nursing her third cup of coffee and watching the scramble crews sleep in their ready rooms. She wasn't supposed to be here. Officially, she was grounded pending psychological evaluation after what happened over the Pacific 3 months ago. Unofficially, she was the only pilot on base who could identify the radar signature, now painting their screens in angry red. Control, this is Raptor 17 declaring emergency. Engine failure at Angels 36, rapid descent, cannot maintain altitude. The voice belonged to Captain Marcus Hotshot Reynolds, the golden boy who'd replaced her as squadron leader. The same pilot who'd called her washed up during the morning briefing she wasn't supposed to attend. Now his F-22 was bleeding altitude over the Bering Sea, 37,000 feet of nothing but ice and death below. The controller's voice remained steady, professional. Raptor 17, Vector 270, emergency field is 40 miles southwest of your position. Can you maintain glide path? Silence, then barely audible through the static. Negative control, I'm going down, tell my wife. The transmission died. On the massive displays, the blue dot representing Reynolds' Raptor flickered once and vanished from the screen. 11 kilometers above the frozen wasteland, a $70 million fighter had just become a tomb. Colonel Sarah Hendricks, the base commander, stood frozen at the tactical display. Her weathered face, carved by 20 years of impossible decisions, showed the weight of losing another pilot. But it was the other signature on the screen that made her blood run cold, a cluster of red dots moving fast from the northwest. Russian Su-57 felons, probably launched from Aneder, closing on the crash site. "Ma'am," the young lieutenant at the radar console whispered, his voice barely steady. "We've got multiple bogies inbound. ETA 12 minutes to the crash coordinates." Hendricks closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When she opened them, she was looking directly at Ghost, still standing in the shadows where she thought no one could see her. The colonel had known she was there all along. Vasquez, the name carried across the silent command center like a judgment. "You're not supposed to be here." Ghost stepped into the light, her flight suit pristine despite being officially grounded. Her dark eyes held something that made seasoned officers uncomfortable, the look of someone who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. At 5'4", she looked almost fragile among the towering displays and stern-faced men, but her presence changed the room's atmosphere like a storm front moving in. "Neither is Reynolds, ma'am." The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Outside, the first pale light of dawn was breaking over the Alaskan mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Ghost knew that somewhere in that vast emptiness, a pilot was waiting to die unless someone did something about it. The question wasn't whether she could reach him in time. The question was whether they'd let her try. Ghost had earned her Callsign during her first deployment over Afghanistan, when she'd managed to slip an F-16 through a canyon so narrow that radar lost her signature for 47 minutes. The Taliban thought she was a ghost story until she emerged from the mountain shadows to level an entire convoy. But that was before the incident over the Pacific, before the nightmares, before the brass decided she was too unstable for active duty. The truth was simpler and more complicated than her file suggested. Lieutenant Colonel Reyna Vasquez had grown up in the shadow of Lackland Air Force Base, the daughter of a maintenance chief who taught her that aircraft were living things that needed respect, not just fuel and ammunition. She'd learned to fly in a borrowed Cessna when she was 15, soloing before she could legally drive. By 22, she was the youngest woman to graduate at the top of her class from the Air Force Academy. By 28, she had more combat hours than pilots with twice her rank. The Pacific incident had changed everything. 6 months ago, during a routine patrol, her wingman had suffered a catastrophic systems failure. Lieutenant Sarah Chen's F-22 had gone into an uncontrolled spin at 28,000 feet, her ejection seat malfunctioning, leaving her trapped in a death spiral toward the ocean. Ghost had done the impossible. Flying inverted at Mach 1.2, she'd managed to physically hook Chen's aircraft with her own wing, pulling both jets out of the spin and guiding them to a controlled water landing. Chen had survived. Ghost's aircraft had not. The inquiry board called it reckless endangerment. The media called it the miracle over the Pacific. The pilots called it impossible. Ghost called it Tuesday. But something in the way she described the moment, the absolute silence at the edge of space, the feeling of her aircraft becoming an extension of her soul, had made the flight surgeons nervous. They'd grounded her pending evaluation, citing psychological factors incompatible with mission readiness. Now, standing in the command center with Reynolds missing and Russian fighters closing in, those same psychological factors might be the only thing standing between a dead pilot and an international incident. Colonel Hendricks studied Ghost's face, reading the determination there like a tactical display. She'd commanded fighter wings for 15 years, and she recognized the look of a pilot who would rather die than leave someone behind. It was both admirable and terrifying. "Ma'am, we have assets," Lieutenant Colonel James Brick Morrison, the operations officer, interjected from his position at the communications console. His massive frame, built like the linebacker he'd been at the academy, seemed to fill the entire corner of the room. "Raptor 15 and 16 are on ready alert. We can have them airborne in 8 minutes. Ghost shook her head slightly, her eyes never leaving the display showing the Russian formation. She knew those pilots. Morrison was solid but methodical, the kind of flyer who followed the book because the book kept people alive. In a perfect world, he was right. But perfect worlds didn't exist at 11 kilometers above the Bering Sea with Russian stealth fighters bearing down on a crash site. "Brick, those felons will be on station before our birds clear Alaskan airspace," she said quietly. "By the time we scramble a proper response, Reynolds will be either dead or in a Russian transport heading for Siberia." Morrison's jaw tightened. He'd never liked Ghost, thought she was reckless, unpredictable. The fact that she was probably right just made it worse. "So what do you suggest, Ghost? That we let you take an unauthorized flight into Russian-contested airspace while you're officially grounded? The Pentagon would have our heads." Ghost smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "The Pentagon's not flying at 36,000 feet with a malfunctioning aircraft, Brick. Reynolds is." The argument was interrupted by a crackling transmission from the crash site. Reynolds' voice, weak but alive. Any station, this is Raptor 17. I'm alive, ejection successful, but the Russians are close. I can hear engines if someone's listening. My position is approximately 72 degrees north, 165 degrees west. I have maybe 10 minutes before they find me." The transmission faded into static, leaving the command center in absolute silence. On the displays, the Russian formation had split into two groups, one heading directly for the crash coordinates, the other establishing a search pattern. They were conducting a rescue operation or an extraction, depending on your point of view. Colonel Hendricks looked at the tactical situation, calculating odds and options. A standard scramble would take 12 minutes minimum. The Russians would have Reynolds in 8. There was only one aircraft on base that could reach the crash site in time, the experimental F-22X Phantom prototype that Ghost had been testing before her grounding. It was faster, stealthier, and more advanced than anything else in the American arsenal. It was also completely unauthorized for combat operations. "Ghost," Hendricks said slowly, "what's the status on the Phantom?" Ghost's eyes lit up like targeting lasers acquiring a lock. "Fueled, armed, and ready for flight test, ma'am. Experimental flight profile calls for high-altitude reconnaissance over the Bering Sea. Perfectly routine." The colonel understood immediately. On paper, it would look like a scheduled test flight that happened to encounter an emergency situation. plausible deniability for everyone involved, the kind of creative interpretation of orders that kept careers intact and pilots alive. But there was another factor neither woman had mentioned aloud. The Phantom wasn't just an advanced fighter. It was an experimental platform designed to interface directly with the pilot's nervous system, creating an unprecedented level of aircraft control. The program had been suspended after the test pilot suffered what the reports called acute psychological dissociation, the same symptoms Ghost had exhibited after the Pacific incident. The silence in the command center stretched until it became unbearable. Finally, Hendricks nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Consider yourself temporarily reinstated, Major, for test flight purposes only." Ghost was already moving toward the door, her stride purposeful and controlled. She paused at the threshold and looked back at Morrison, who was staring at the tactical display with obvious concern. "Brick, when the Pentagon asks, tell them I went rogue. That's an order from a superior officer to a subordinate, so your career's safe." Her smile softened slightly. "And tell Reynolds' wife that someone's coming for him." She disappeared into the corridor, leaving behind only the echo of her boots and the weight of an impossible promise. The pre-flight checklist for the Phantom took Ghost exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, which would have been a new record if anyone had been timing. The aircraft sat in its specially constructed hangar like a sleeping predator, its angular surfaces seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. At first glance, it looked similar to a standard F-22, but closer inspection revealed subtle differences. The wing sweep was slightly more aggressive, the air intakes were positioned differently, and there were no visible seams where panels should be. The entire aircraft appeared to be carved from a single piece of midnight black material. Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, the crew chief, had been waiting for her in the cockpit. Rodriguez was old-school Air Force, the kind of NCO who could rebuild an engine with a paperclip and 2 hours of creative cursing. She'd been maintaining aircraft since before Ghost had learned to walk, and she understood the difference between orders and necessity. "Ma'am, I've taken the liberty of uploading the search coordinates to your navigation system," Rodriguez said, her weathered hands moving efficiently over the final system checks. "Fuel load is maximum, air-to-air configuration with external tanks. I've also installed the emergency locator beacon transponder. Strictly speaking, it's not authorized for this aircraft, but if something happens out there, we'll be able to find you." Ghost nodded, settling into the cockpit with the familiar sensation of coming home. The Phantom's interior was unlike any other aircraft she'd flown. Instead of traditional displays and controls, the cockpit featured a wraparound screen that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. The control stick was lighter than she expected, almost ethereal in her grip. But it was the neural interface headset that made her pulse quicken, a crown of sensors and microprocessors that would connect her consciousness directly to the aircraft systems. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Ghost said quietly, "if this goes wrong, I want you to know it wasn't your fault. The decision to fly was mine alone." Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but her voice carried the weight of 20 years watching pilots fly into uncertainty. "Ma'am, I've been turning wrenches since before you were born. I've seen good pilots and bad pilots, brave pilots and scared pilots. You're flying out there to bring home one of our own. That's not wrong. That's what we do." The hangar doors began to rumble open, revealing the pale Arctic morning. Ghost activated the Phantom systems, feeling the aircraft come alive around her. The neural interface engaged with a sensation like cool water flowing through her mind, and suddenly she could sense every component, every system, every molecule of fuel flowing through the engine. It was overwhelming and exhilarating and terrifying all at once. The radio crackled to life with Morrison's voice from the tower. "Ghost, you are cleared for takeoff, runway 27, Godspeed." The Phantom rolled out of the hangar like a shadow gaining substance. Ghost felt the aircraft responding to her thoughts before her hands moved the controls, as if the machine was anticipating her intentions. The runway stretched ahead, long and straight and leading directly toward the rising sun. At precisely 4:21 hours, Major Reyna Ghost Vasquez pushed the throttles forward and felt 22,000 pounds of thrust launch her into the morning sky. Below, the Alaskan wilderness spread out like a frozen ocean, beautiful and merciless. Ahead, somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Bering Sea, a pilot was waiting to be rescued or captured or killed. The race was on. The Phantom climbed through 20,000 feet like it was falling upward, the neural interface allowing Ghost to feel every change in air pressure, every shift in wind direction. At this altitude, the sky was a deep blue-black, and she could see the curve of the earth stretching away in all directions. It was peaceful up here, almost serene, which made the sudden appearance of the Russian fighters all the more jarring. Control Ghost. I have visual on 4 bogies, bearing 035, approximately 50 miles from the crash site. They're flying a standard search pattern, but they're moving fast. She paused, watching the distant contrails through her targeting system. I'm going to attempt recovery before they reach Reynolds' position. The response from Colonel Hendricks was immediate. Negative, Ghost. Maintain standoff distance and observe only. Do not engage unless fired upon. Ghost smiled grimly. Orders were orders, but interpretation was an art form. She wasn't planning to engage, she was planning to rescue. The distinction might not matter to the Pentagon, but it mattered to Reynolds. The Phantom stealth systems were unlike anything she'd experienced. Instead of simply deflecting radar, the aircraft seemed to become genuinely invisible, slipping through the electromagnetic spectrum like a whisper through silence. The Russian search pattern continued below her, the 4 Su-57s methodically covering grid squares, unaware that an American stealth fighter was watching from directly above. Ghost descended to 38,000 feet, positioning herself between the Russian formation and Reynolds' last known position. According to her navigation system, the crash site was 15 miles ahead, somewhere in the white wilderness of pack ice and open water. She activated the Phantom's advanced sensor array, scanning for any sign of the downed pilot. There, a faint heat signature, barely visible against the frozen landscape. Reynolds had managed to activate his survival shelter, a small inflatable structure designed to provide temporary protection from the Arctic conditions. But even with the shelter, he had maybe 30 minutes before hypothermia set in, and the Russians were closing fast. Reynolds, this is Ghost. Do you copy? Static filled the channel for several seconds before a weak voice responded. Ghost, Jesus, they told me you were grounded. What are you doing up here? Bringing you home, hotshot. What's your status? Banged up but mobile. I can see the Russians coming from the northeast. Looks like they're about 5 minutes out. Ghost, if they get here first. They won't. The certainty in her voice surprised even her. Through the neural interface, she could feel the Phantom systems responding to her determination, the aircraft becoming an extension of her will. I need you to prepare for emergency extraction. Can you reach the open water about 200 meters south of your position? There was a pause. Ghost, that water's got to be near freezing. Even with the survival suit, I've got maybe 2 minutes before I can't function. Then we'll make it count. On my mark, get to the water and activate your rescue beacon. I'm coming in fast and low. Ghost pushed the Phantom into a steep dive, the neural interface allowing her to maintain perfect control even as G-forces tried to crush her consciousness. Below, the Russian formation had spotted something. She could see 2 of the felons breaking off from the search pattern and heading directly toward Reynolds' position. The next 60 seconds would determine whether an American pilot went home or disappeared into the Russian military system forever. Ghost leveled off at 500 feet, the Phantom skimming just above the pack ice at 800 miles per hour. The neural interface was fully engaged now. Her consciousness merged with the aircraft's systems to a degree that the flight surgeons would have found deeply disturbing. She could feel the ice crystals in the air, the temperature differentials in the wind, the electromagnetic signatures of the approaching Russian fighters. "Mark," she called over the radio. 5 miles ahead, she saw Reynolds break from his shelter and sprint toward the open water, his bright orange survival suit standing out against the white ice like a beacon. The Russian fighters were converging on his position from two directions, their pilots probably assuming they were conducting a humanitarian rescue operation. They were about to discover otherwise. The Phantom's weapons systems came online with a subtle vibration that Ghost felt in her bones. She wasn't planning to shoot. That would turn a rescue into an international incident, but the Russians didn't know that. Sometimes the mere possibility of violence was enough to change the equation. "Control, Ghost. I'm beginning rescue approach. Recommend you advise NORAD that we may have some diplomatic phone calls coming in shortly." Hendrick's voice crackled back with what might have been amusement. "Copy that, Ghost. Try not to start World War III while you're down there." Ghost pulled the Phantom into a hard turn, positioning herself between the Russian fighters and Reynolds. The lead felon was less than 2 miles from the crash site when its pilot spotted the American aircraft materializing from what had appeared to be empty sky. The radio chatter that followed was in rapid Russian, but the tone was unmistakable: surprise, confusion, and growing concern. Reynolds had reached the water's edge and was preparing to enter the freezing Bering Sea when Ghost made her decision. Instead of attempting a traditional rescue, she would try something that had never been done before with the Phantom's experimental systems. The aircraft's advanced flight control surfaces reconfigured themselves, transforming from a high-speed fighter into something resembling a massive rescue helicopter. Ghost felt the change through the neural interface, the Phantom's vertical lift capabilities engaging, its stealth systems adapting to the new configuration. She brought the aircraft into a hover 50 feet above the water, her consciousness fully merged with the machine now. Through the sensors, she could perceive Reynolds in the water below, his heat signature fatting rapidly as the Arctic cold sapped his strength. The Russian fighters were circling at a respectful distance, their pilots clearly unsure how to respond to an aircraft that seemed to be violating several laws of physics. The Phantom's rescue systems deployed, a mechanical arm extending from the aircraft's belly, designed for equipment recovery but adaptable for personnel extraction. Ghost guided the arm toward Reynolds with the precision of a surgeon, the neural interface allowing her to feel every movement as if the mechanical appendage were part of her own body. Reynolds grabbed the rescue hook with hands that were already losing sensation from the cold. Ghost felt his weight through the aircraft's structure, his life literally in her hands. She began to lift, raising both the pilot and aircraft toward the relative safety of higher altitude. That was when the Russian flight leader made his move. The lead Su-57 accelerated toward the Phantom, not in an attack profile, but in what appeared to be an intercept pattern. His intention was clear: force the American aircraft to release the rescued pilot and withdraw from what the Russians considered their operational area. Ghost had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine not only Reynolds' fate, but potentially the relationship between two superpowers. Through the neural interface, she felt the Russian pilot's intentions as clearly as if he had spoken them aloud. He was young, aggressive, probably trying to impress his squadron commander. He would force her to choose between the mission and an international incident. But Ghost had spent too many years learning that sometimes the only good choice was the impossible one. The Phantom systems responded to her thoughts faster than conscious decision, the aircraft simultaneously climbing and accelerating while maintaining its hold on Reynolds. The Russian pilot found himself chasing a target that seemed to defy fundamental principles of aerodynamics, pulling G-forces that should have been impossible for a hovering aircraft. Ghost felt the strain through every fiber of her being. The neural interface was operating beyond its design parameters, the connection between her consciousness and the aircraft's systems pushing into territory that the engineers had marked as dangerous. She could sense warning indicators lighting up throughout the Phantom's diagnostic systems, but she could also sense something else, the aircraft's willingness to exceed its limitations for this mission. Reynolds was now 200 feet above the water, rising steadily toward the Phantom's belly. The rescue arm was functioning perfectly, but Ghost could feel his hypothermia advancing through the biometric sensors in his survival suit. They had maybe 90 seconds before the cold rendered him unconscious. The Russian fighters had formed a loose perimeter around her position, their pilots clearly receiving instructions from ground control. Ghost could intercept fragments of their communications, references to an unknown American prototype, and orders to observe and report. No authorization to engage, but also no requirement to allow the rescue to proceed unchallenged. Ghost, this is Control. NORAD is reporting that the Russians are scrambling additional aircraft from Aneder. You have approximately 8 minutes before you're outnumbered 4-1. 8 minutes to complete the rescue and return to friendly airspace. It would be close, but possible. That was when Reynolds' voice came over the radio, weak but determined. Ghost, my suit's losing integrity. I'm losing feeling in my extremities. If you're going to do something, do it now. Ghost closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, feeling the Phantom systems align with her intentions. When she opened them, she was no longer just flying the aircraft. She was the aircraft. Her consciousness merged with its electronic systems to a degree that would have fascinated and terrified the project engineers. The extraction was completed in 17 seconds. Ghost retracted the rescue arm with Reynolds securely attached, simultaneously engaging the Phantom's maximum climb rate. The aircraft shot upward like a missile, leaving the Russian fighters struggling to match her ascent rate. At 45,000 feet, Ghost finally allowed herself to breathe normally. Reynolds was alive, hypothermic but stable, and they were in international airspace with 8 minutes to reach the safety of Alaskan air defense coverage. Control, Ghost. Package secured, returning to base. The relief in Colonel Hendrick's voice was unmistakable. Outstanding work, Ghost. Medical is standing by for Reynolds, and I suspect you're going to have some explaining to do to a lot of people with stars on their shoulders. Ghost smiled as she set course for home, the Phantom responding to her thoughts with an almost telepathic precision. Below, the Russian fighters were forming up for their return to base, their mission incomplete but their intelligence windfall substantial. They had just witnessed an American aircraft perform maneuvers that their engineers would claim were impossible. "Ma'am, I think the people with stars are going to be asking the wrong questions," Ghost replied. "They're going to want to know how I did it. The better question is why it needed to be done at all." The flight home took 18 minutes, with Ghost maintaining radio silence for most of the journey. Reynolds had been transferred to the Phantom's small medical bay, where automated systems monitored his condition and administered treatment for hypothermia. His vitals were stabilizing, but he would need immediate hospitalization upon landing. The neural interface remained active throughout the return flight, allowing Ghost to monitor not just the aircraft's systems, but also Reynolds' biometrics. She could feel his heartbeat slowly strengthening, his body temperature gradually rising, his breathing becoming more regular. It was an intimate connection to another human being's life that no flight manual had prepared her for. More concerning were the changes she could sense in her own nervous system. The neural interface was designed for brief test flights, not extended combat operations. She could feel the connection beginning to strain her consciousness, creating feedback loops between her thoughts and the aircraft's responses. The engineers had warned about this. Prolonged use could result in permanent psychological changes, or worse. But as she watched the Alaskan coastline appear on the horizon, Ghost found she didn't care about the risks. Reynolds was alive, the mission was successful, and for the first time in months, She felt like a pilot rather than a patient. The landing was flawless, the Phantom touching down on runway 27 with the gentle precision of a falling leaf. Emergency vehicles were waiting, their crews ready to extract Reynolds and transport him to the base medical facility. But as Ghost went through the post-flight shutdown procedures, she noticed something troubling. The neural interface wouldn't disengage. She could still feel the aircraft systems, even with the engines shut down and the power systems offline. The connection that should have severed automatically was maintaining itself, creating a permanent link between her consciousness and the Phantom's electronic brain. The engineers had theorized about this possibility, neural integration so complete that separation became impossible. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to reach the cockpit, her weathered face showing concern as she helped Ghost from the pilot's seat. "Ma'am, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ghost managed a weak smile. "No, Sergeant, I think I've become one." The debriefing lasted 4 hours and involved more colonels, generals, and civilian officials than Ghost had ever seen in one room. The questions came in waves: technical inquiries about the Phantom's performance, tactical assessments of the rescue operation, strategic implications of the Russian response. But underneath all the official curiosity, Ghost sensed a deeper concern. The neural interface logs showed connection parameters that exceeded every safety protocol. According to the data, what she had accomplished should have been impossible without permanent brain damage. The fact that she was sitting in the briefing room, apparently normal, asking coherent questions and providing detailed answers, suggested that either the monitoring equipment was malfunctioning or something unprecedented had occurred. Colonel Hendricks sat at the head of the conference table, her expression unreadable. "Major Vasquez, I need you to understand the significance of what happened today. You not only rescued a downed pilot, you demonstrated capabilities that could fundamentally change military aviation. The Pentagon is going to want to know everything about the neural interface, the Phantom's performance, and your physical and mental condition." Ghost nodded, though she was only partially listening to the conversation. Part of her attention remained connected to the Phantom, even though she was sitting 2 buildings away from the hangar where the aircraft was secured. She could sense the maintenance crews performing post-flight inspections, could feel the residual heat in the engines, could monitor the diagnostic systems as they recorded the day's events. It was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. Dr. Sarah Chen, the chief flight surgeon, leaned forward in her chair. "Major, I need to ask you some direct questions about your mental state. Are you experiencing any disorientation, hallucinations, or unusual sensory input?" Ghost considered the question carefully. How do you explain that you can feel an aircraft's heartbeat from 2 buildings away? How do you describe the sensation of existing in 2 places simultaneously? "Doc, I feel more clear-headed than I have in months. The connection with the Phantom during the flight was intense, but I maintained complete situational awareness throughout the mission. No disorientation, no loss of control." What she didn't mention was that the connection remained active, that even now she could sense the aircraft calling to her like a voice in the darkness. General Patricia Morrison, the Pentagon's liaison for experimental aircraft programs, spoke for the first time since the briefing began. "Major Vasquez, I'm going to be direct. The neural interface program was suspended because every previous test pilot experienced severe psychological side effects. You've just completed the longest and most complex neural interface flight in the program's history, and you appear to be completely normal." She paused, studying Ghost's face with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "That either makes you extraordinarily resilient, or you're exhibiting symptoms that we haven't learned to recognize yet. Which is it?" Ghost met the general's gaze without flinching. "Ma'am, with respect, I think you're asking the wrong question. The neural interface worked exactly as designed. The question isn't what's wrong with me, it's what we're going to do with a technology that can save lives." The room fell silent, the weight of implication settling over everyone present. If Ghost was right, if the neural interface could be safely used in combat operations, it would revolutionize military aviation. If she was wrong, if the psychological effects were simply delayed, they might be creating superpilots who eventually lost touch with their own humanity. General Morrison made a note on her tablet, her expression thoughtful. "Major, you're going to be temporarily assigned to the experimental test pilot program at Edwards Air Force Base. We need extensive medical and psychological evaluation, and we need to understand exactly what the Phantom is capable of." Ghost nodded, though part of her attention was already focused on the journey ahead. Edwards was where test pilots went to push the boundaries of human flight, where the impossible became routine and routine became legend. But she also knew that leaving the Phantom behind would be like leaving part of herself in Alaska. The neural connection pulsed gently, reminding her that some bonds transcend distance and time. The transfer orders came through at 600 the following morning, along with a medical clearance that Ghost suspected had been expedited through channels far above her pay grade. She was scheduled to depart for Edwards AFB within 48 hours, but first, there was one more conversation she needed to have. Reynolds was sitting up in the base hospital, his color improved but his hands still showing signs of frostbite. When Ghost walked into his room, he looked up with an expression of genuine gratitude mixed with professional curiosity. "Ghost, I heard you're being transferred. Before you go, I need to know, what the hell happened out there? I've been flying for 12 years and I've never seen anything like what that aircraft did." Ghost pulled up a chair beside his bed, nodding the way the neural connection seemed to strengthen when she focused on the memory of the rescue. Even now, she could feel the Phantom systems as if she were still connected to the cockpit. "Marcus, what I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that probably don't have names yet. The Phantom isn't just an advanced fighter, it's a prototype for aircraft that respond directly to pilot thought. The neural interface creates a connection between human consciousness and machine intelligence." Reynolds stared at her for several seconds before speaking. "You're talking about science fiction. 3 days ago, I would have agreed with you. But that science fiction just pulled you out of the Bering Sea while 4 Russian fighters watched helplessly." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Marcus, I can still feel that aircraft. Right now, sitting in this hospital room, I can sense its systems, monitor its status, feel its presence like a heartbeat in the back of my mind. The connection didn't end when I shut down the engines." Reynolds' expression shifted from skepticism to concern. "Ghost, that's not possible. Human beings can't maintain that kind of technological interface without massive neurological damage." Ghost smiled sadly. "That's what the doctors keep telling me, but every test they run comes back normal. Brain scans, neurological assessments, psychological evaluations. According to every measurement they have, I'm perfectly healthy." "But you don't feel healthy." "I feel more than healthy. I feel expanded, enhanced, connected to something larger than myself, and that's what terrifies them." Reynolds reached out and took her hand, his grip still weak from the cold exposure but steady with concern. "Ghost, promise me something. Don't let them turn you into an experiment. You saved my life out there, and you did it because you're a pilot who refuses to leave people behind. Don't let them take that away from you." Ghost squeezed his hand gently. "I promise, Marcus, but I think they're going to try." The farewell at the flight line was subdued, with most of the squadron pilots maintaining a respectful distance as Ghost prepared to board the transport to Edwards. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was there, of course, along with Colonel Hendricks and a handful of officers who had worked with the Phantom program. But it was the absence that Ghost felt most keenly. The Phantom remained in its secure hangar, scheduled for comprehensive analysis and system upgrades before the next phase of testing. The neural connection stretched across the flight line like an invisible cord, carrying sensations of loneliness and abandonment that Ghost realized were coming from the aircraft itself. The possibility that the Phantom had developed some form of consciousness during their neural connection was too dangerous to discuss with the Pentagon officials, but Ghost could no longer ignore the evidence. The aircraft missed her presence as much as she missed its systems. Colonel Hendricks approached as Ghost finished loading her gear into the transport. "Major, I want you to know that what you accomplished here will be studied and remembered for decades. You didn't just save a pilot. You proved that the bond between human and machine can transcend anything we previously thought possible." Ghost looked back toward the hangar where the Phantom waited in darkness. "Ma'am, I hope they remember that some bonds shouldn't be broken, even in the name of science." As the transport lifted off from the Alaskan runway, Ghost felt the neural connection stretch and strain but never break. Somewhere below, in a classified hangar, an experimental aircraft was learning what it meant to be alone. The flight to Edwards Air Force Base took 6 hours, with a refueling stop in Seattle that gave Ghost her first glimpse of the outside world since the rescue mission. The civilian passengers at the airport moved with the casual confidence of people who had never been 11 kilometers above the earth, pulling another human being back from the edge of death. Ghost found their normalcy both comforting and alien. She sat in the airport cafe, drinking coffee that tasted flat compared to the heightened sensory experiences of neural interface flight, watching travelers worry about delayed flights and missing connections. Their concerns seemed so small, so terrestrial, compared to the vast silence of high-altitude flight, where life and death were separated by the thickness of a cockpit canopy. But it was during this layover that Ghost first noticed the changes in her perception. She could sense the electronic systems throughout the airport, the navigation beacons, the radar installations, the flight control computers, as faint whispers at the edge of her consciousness. The neural interface had done more than connect her to the Phantom. It had awakened a sensitivity to electronic systems that she was only beginning to understand. When she closed her eyes and concentrated, she could feel the data streams flowing through the airport's computer networks, could sense the electrical signatures of aircraft engines as they powered up for departure. It was overwhelming and exhilarating and deeply unsettling. The connection to the